everybody, and welcome to another episode on the Godel Pod. This episode today is called Agile Delivery, How to Keep the Train on the Tracks. Firstly, let me introduce myself. So my name is Laura Ainscough, and I'm a Service Delivery Manager here at Godel Technologies. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking to my guest, Lydia Hawthorn, who is Head of Product Delivery from the UK's leading pool betting operator, the Tote Group. So a warm welcome from us.
Hello.
Welcome. I'll let you introduce yourself, Lydia.
Cool. So I'm Lydia. I'm the Head of Product Delivery at the Tote. And I've been at the Tote nearly a year and a half now, leading an Agile transformation there. But prior to that, I was at a tech incubator called Tech Nation, looking after delivery there. So yeah, it's really great to be here.
Cool. So obviously we've been in a partnership for over a year now, so I know exactly what the Tote Group do. Well, hopefully. I suppose just for our listeners, would you have to just kind of go into what the Tote Group are about and what they do?
Yeah, of course. So I think the Tote is fairly synonymous with on-course betting, specifically within horse racing. It's where sort of our lineage comes from. And we're a pools operator. So rather than fixed odds betting that you might find with another provider, when you bet with the Tote, you're betting a stake into a larger pool, which you are then essentially looking to win a dividend of, depending on how many other people in that pool bet the same way as you or bet another winner. Depends really then on how much of the dividend you receive out of the pool. We're the only pools operator in the UK, and it puts us in a fairly unique position really in the market.
Brilliant. And how big is the company in regards to how many employees do you have?
So we've reached 180 something.
Yeah, don't know if that's big needed.
180 and change at the moment, yes. So it's been a lot of growth over the last sort of 3 years.
Yeah.
Since the buyback. Tote had been owned as a brand by Betfred previously, and over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been buying back the business so that it's now a standalone business owned by the Alizetti Group, which is made up of roughly 155 individual investors who are passionate about horse racing and feel that the Tote had a standalone brand that really would warrant some focus. It's just been growing ever since, really.
Yeah, brilliant. And I suppose, if we just get back onto our topic of the day, Agile delivery, I suppose it'd be good for our listeners just to introduce and how Agile delivery work works within the Tote Group.
Yeah, of course. So as I mentioned, I came on board about a year and a half ago now to lead the transformation at the Tote. Prior to that, they'd been using Scrum, a fairly basic implementation of several Scrum teams, and they were looking really to lead the charge on a safe implementation, so a scaled Agile framework, which looks at adding a scaled layer of processes, visibility, on top of a Scrum layer, really. So at the moment, we are a year and a half into that implementation. It's heading towards a portfolio implementation of SAFe versus an essential version of SAFe, which for anybody who understands SAFe methodologies, there is a difference. So we structured everything on top of that base layer, that basic Scrum layer, and added in everything else on top, really. So as well as being the head of Agile, head of product delivery, my title is also an RTE, which is a release train engineer, which is a specific role within a SAFe framework that keeps the train on the track, which is exactly the point of the podcast.
And I suppose talking about kind of keeping that train on the track, within these kind of processes, there's always probably times you divert or kind of feel like you're losing control and coming off that track. I suppose, what's the kind of key things that you do to try and keep everything in line and kind of handle those changes, but make sure everyone kind of knows where they're going in that right direction?
Yeah, I think ultimately there was a lot of work when we first started at providing the right level of visibility from a strategic roadmap perspective, which traditionally is owned at maybe an opco level or by senior stakeholders in the business, mapping that visibility of what commercially we wanted to do as a business, then into the squads in terms of what is it that they're actually delivering day to day. And it was clear that there wasn't that much awareness really of what either side were doing. And so actually it can be as simple as just shining a light so that there's an understanding of what's happening at a strategic versus a tactical level.
Yeah.
I think that has then helped create a little bit more of a North Star, and there's definitely more that we need to be doing. But as our strategy has changed over the last 3 or 4 years, we were in a fairly unique position where we started with almost no digital assets when we bought the business back. So we had no website, no app. So initially it was, how do we turn the lights on?
Yeah.
To more of a, okay, how do we keep the lights on, and then how do we light more lights? So those sorts of things have changed really our strategic approach over the last few years, and naturally then they begin to inform what the tactical pieces of work end up looking like.
Yeah.
Everything from the actual tech enablers to new feature work.
Yeah.
So when people feel that the train is coming off of the track, it's I suppose a chance to litmus test, okay, how aligned are both of those things? How aligned are the micro and the macro? And that's the first bit to revisit, really. There's so much more after that. Once you've diagnosed where the misalignment is, how do you actually treat it? But I think that's the key sort of question that you need to ask yourself if you're seeing that happen inside of your squads.
Yeah. And is there, just to dig a little deeper there, is there kind of a specific example you can use there where things did go in probably a different direction, both sides were heading there, and how you did then align it back?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, sometimes it can come down to even basic things like requirement gathering. So obviously we work in a very highly regulated industry. We are very passionate at the Tote about keeping our customers safe and not just doing the bare minimum. And doing more to provide that safe space to enjoy gambling responsibly with the Tote. But what that means is, within an agile setting, the whole emphasis is on delivering value and the flow of value out to the customer as frequently as possible. And it's where you get this concept of an MVP, like a minimum viable product, coming from. It's not because we want to do something basic and we think that, oh, that's good enough. It's, how do we make the customer feel value is being delivered to them on a regular basis? And when it comes to compliance, for example, there'll be certain items around self-exclusions, for example, or loss limits or deposit limits that we're trying to do not only in line with what the regulation says, but also to the level that we feel is responsible inside the Tote and doesn't invite any extra risk for our customers. But in order to do that, you really have to question and drill down somewhat into the requirements sometimes of what is absolutely necessary, and then that creates your phase 1. And what are the enhancements, and that creates the phase 2. And that can be at times a bit people need some reassurance around that sometimes, that you're not just going to do phase 1 and forget about phase 2 later. The enhancements will happen, but that in order to, we could either wait 6 months and get the all bells and whistles, or we could deliver a piece of value to the customer within 3 months and then focus on the enhancements afterwards. And so it's important when you're going through a transformation that you set expectations so that people see when these situations happen, they're not ambushed by them. They will set the expectation that these are exactly the sorts of difficult conversations and challenges that are presented when going through transformation. And if people know what to look out for, they know then, oh wait, this isn't a signifier of something going wrong. It is just a natural process that comes with change, really, and the agile mindset.
And it helps people kind of get used to change in that way as well, and creates that norm behavior as well.
Precisely. I think everybody sees change and transformation as disruptors, and what I say is, I want to disrupt, but I don't want to be disruptive. And there is a difference, and you really do have to focus a lot of time on the hearts and minds piece of bringing people on the journey with you. It's a very lonely place to be in change and transformation if there isn't a real good set of allies that are helping sort of signpost you along the way. And these are not always individuals within product and engineering. Quite often they're the people in risk or in compliance or in customer care or in marketing or in data. And when you have those allies in those spaces, they're advocating for you even when you're not in the room. It's a massive part of affecting real change, because you're not just wanting to be agile by name only. There's no point implementing a load of processes if people don't understand the benefits and aren't really truly embracing them because they see the impact that they could have. And so you really do need to rely on those core allies really to help you push an agenda, not a sort of scary agenda, one that you genuinely, really wholeheartedly believe is going to bring positive change to the business.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I suppose coming back to your role, predominantly head of product delivery, and I suppose to our listeners as well who are in a similar role, why is agile delivery so crucial to your position and the product delivery of Tote Group?
I think, you know, agile and is underpinned by a fairly standard set of values, but a core one is about being, you know, customer centric and 100% making sure that you're not scared to make quick decisions or test and learn relentlessly, if as long as it's in the name of what's best for the customer. And at the Tote, you know, our customer is so important to us, not in a necessarily because obviously every B2C business, every B2B business, their customer is important, but our customer is a massive part of our identity. We're, as a brand, incredibly passionate about horse racing, about, you know, giving back to the horse racing community, about celebrating the heritage, the deep heritage that is there, and it's reflected through its fan base. And those are the customers, you know, the people who are watching ITV7 and reading the papers on the weekend, the Racing Post, to understand what they're going to bet on that weekend. Those are the individuals that we want to make feel at home, you know, with the Tote. And also, you know, calling a spade is slightly more difficult to position the pools offering out in the market than it is a fixed odd bet. It's a bit more complicated, it's not as common, and people, you know, we want to make it easy for them to see the value that the Tote provides. So if you work back from that, well, how do we do that? You know, agile delivery is, as I said before, about bringing value as fast as possible to the customer and at a relentless pace, so they never feel like they've been forgotten. But it's also about the level of insight that we're expecting upfront that helps us inform what the product looks like through user experience research, feeding that into the designs, and also making sure that, you know, in Agile, what we want to do is it's called set-based design. We want to preserve our options for as long as possible. So rather than starting out with one option, which has been massively defined up front, the product needs to look like this in order to serve the needs of the customer. And along the way, you realize, oh, either technologically, that's a challenge to provide it in exactly that sort of package, or you learn another piece of insight that challenges what you initially thought. If you haven't preserved your options, you then have to spend time diverging from that one initial plan and going back and figuring out plan B. Whereas if you've preserved your options up front, you've got a plan A, plan B, plan C, plan up to Z, depending on how deep you want to go. And it's very easy then to just change track onto the second one. And, you know, we always say in Agile, you really don't want to be afraid of changing things. We actually welcome change, because what it tells us is that we've learned something that will bring us closer to what it is our customer needs. So it aligns very, very nicely with our own product mission and what we're trying to do with the business. But you know, it's also well proven to produce higher quality product. So it's hard to see why you wouldn't want to do that when you're operating on a product centric, customer centric model.
And I suppose obviously within your industry and product, obviously I know it well from working with you over the year, but would you recommend this type of approach with maybe products that aren't as fast growing and changing as much as your industry, just for maybe listeners out there who obviously aren't in a similar industry?
Yeah, I've implemented Agile in non-tech spaces. So even, okay, you've got tech, say fast-moving tech that is in a scale-up, for example, a business that is rapidly either pivoting or their route to market is speeding up. That there's that sort of use case, I suppose. You've got tech that, as you said, maybe a bit more well established. It is a little bit more like keeping the lights on. But even then, you know, tech is a space that innately seeks out innovation. It innately lives on that cutting edge. And, you know, a business that is seeking to continue to keep up with the pace of other competitors, the needs of the customer, should always really be acting with agility. But you've got businesses as well that are not in the tech space, and like I said, I've implemented agile practices there. And I think really I very rarely meet real proper purist agile, apply the book, rule for rule, and then this is how you get a successful Agile implementation. The majority of us are sensible individuals with the business acumen to understand that there are some times where a purist approach is not going to suit the business. And so I always try to differentiate really between Agile frameworks, which are obviously the guiding structures and sort of processes around the flavor of Agile you're using. So in our case, SAFe, but it could be Scrum at Scale, it could be Scrumban, Kanban, Lean. So that's the framework piece, but then you've got the toolkits, and really creating Agile cultures and bringing Agile mindset to your employees is about empowering them, getting them to understand what is an Agile mindset, number one, and number two, how do they live, eat, breathe it in their day-to-day roles. And so there are teams across Tote that are not tech teams and they're not product teams, but they can see and understand Agile principles, and what we do is just equip them with the toolkits so that then they're clear on, okay, yeah, we've got these guiding frameworks, but really what's important is that you've got the right toolkits available to you within that Agile framework to do your job well. And I think ultimately, if it comes down to that, then you can't go far wrong, really.
No, that's great. And I suppose kind of nicely linked in to obviously the SAFe framework that you've implemented. I suppose it would be good to kind of hear if there were any difficulties adopting that.
I mean,
the laugh says it all.
I think the interesting thing is, of course there are challenges. Of course there are difficulties. I mean, when I joined, the idea of running a PI planning, so within SAFe, you have every ceremony that would be ran in a Scrum layer is scaled up. So instead of just having a sprint planning, you have a PI planning, and a PI is a group of sprints, usually 5. And you're planning for 5 sprints worth of work. So those PI plannings, it requires a lot of refinement to go into them. The product management teams need to come with their use cases, their stories written well. There needs to be a level of estimation having been done, so the team's familiar with the piece of work, some identification of dependencies on other teams, and if there's any tech blockers preventing the work from being done. So all of these sorts of things, when you start from scratch, they feel very, very daunting as a big to-do list of things that you need to have done before PI planning happens. And I think PI planning can sometimes seem a bit prescriptive, and that like you have to go in there with all of the information. The whole point of co-locating the planning is that you're expected that you won't have all the answers, but that the person who does have the answer you need is somewhere in the room or adjacent to you. And I think starting, at the Tote, they'd done a couple of PI plannings, but it felt very, very daunting going into the idea that we would be running them consistently going forward. So I just made PIs very short. We didn't plan for 5 sprints. We planned for 2 sprints, and we had a week planning and like innovation sprint in between. So it wasn't a full sprint, it was a week. So really we were looking at PIs that were 5 weeks long. And when you broke it down like that, the rinse and repeat opportunities were just relentless. By the time we'd got to the point where everybody was ready to lengthen the PIs, people were like, oh god, please not another PI planning. And I was like, I don't want another PI planning either. I mean, the overheads are massive to sort of organize one, and get everybody together. And we were doing all of this during lockdowns. So when it was safe, we would come into the office, but when it wasn't, then we were having to facilitate remotely. And there were times, obviously working with Godel, we do have hybrid teams where some are abroad and some are in the UK, and having to facilitate hybrid teams is a challenge too. But again, it's adopting that Agile principle of test and learn, like relentless improvement, relentlessly trying to learn. And how do you do that? Well, you just do it as often as you possibly can. But my role in particular, and anybody in a head of product delivery role, head of Agile delivery role, they're not strangers to challenge. If you go into a transformation thinking, oh, what a key measure of success for me is that I don't have any fails or any challenges, you're really missing the point. You probably haven't adopted the Agile mindset yourself.
In the wrong job.
Because you can't just always learn through positive experiences. And we welcome, fail fast is another big concept that sits in the Agile community. Is if you're going to fail, figure it out quickly though, learn that lesson as fast as you possibly can, and then move forward with what it's taught you. So I think it's great that we talk about our failures, it's great that we talk about the challenges that we've been set up against, but they shouldn't be unexpected. It's kind of part of the course when you're in this role. Exactly. Yeah.
And I suppose kind of spinning that as well, because again, like we've got challenges, but I think there's been huge positives within the year and a half and the change of behaviour as well in tote. I suppose it's good. I suppose quite directed, but has the agile approach worked? Have you seen the benefits and the positives that's come with it?
Absolutely. And, I think one thing that we could have done more upfront was set some more clear OKRs around how we would measure that success.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I went in initially, and because they have that Scrum layer that exists, and it's a good place to start, especially if a transformation is daunting you. I got brought in specifically to do that. But if you're in-house now and you're embarking upon a transformation, you don't really know where to start.
Yeah.
Health check what you've currently got, and then you'll start to see where the dysfunctions are, where the low-hanging fruit is, the stuff that's quick to fix and a quick win, as well as the stuff that's probably more systemic and that's going to take longer to change. And so I did those health checks, and that was a very good way of us measuring, from that baseline, how we'd improved within 6 months, within another 6 months. And so immediately the second health check we did, those markers were improving. It's sort of we started at a 3.65 out of 5. The next one was a 4.25. And also within SAFE, what's very helpful is they actually use a metric around predictability of the release train, which is all of your squads together. And you can look at predictability of squads based on the objectives that they set in their PI plan. And then you can obviously roll that up into a predictability score across the entire release train. And they'd say, we need to be able to see, really SAFE is saying anything over 80 is fantastic, because we expect change. Right? We're not ever looking for, and actually being over 100% is not good either, because what you've done then is delivered more than you set out to deliver, which you might think, okay, brilliant, but at what cost was that? Because there's a business readiness piece around delivering tech, right? You can't just say, oh, here's this brand new product, off it goes. Marketing needs to be involved. They need to come up with the campaigns. We need to prepare customer care if there are new bet types coming through, so that if they get a query, they know what it's referencing, etc. So if you've delivered more than anticipated, does that mean all the other departments actually needed to then rush to support that release? So we really want that sweet spot of sort of 80%, and we're consistently hitting that, and that's been an uplift from around 50. So I think, as I said, I'd like to have spent a bit more time up front, I think, in hindsight, and it's a great lesson to have learned, setting some of those OKRs and allowing some of the metrics we could have been a bit more creative, I think, with them. But yeah, generally speaking, it's working. It's doing what we want.
You're doing your job well.
Well, for now,
and I suppose kind of moving in the future, within the tech industry, there's always new trends, new ways of doing things, and that's what we're always open to. But I suppose, how do yourself and obviously the Tote Group then kind of keep up with these trends and learn about them, embed them?
So I think the Tote as a company, obviously, we are in a unique space in the UK market, but globally as well, we're in a very interesting position, because we can commingle into other countries via other totes. So it really gives us a sense of community because a tote is really just a structure. It's just a type of betting operator, right? And we happen to be called the UK Tote, but there is a tote in France and Sweden and in America and Australia. And when you are able to learn from the international community about what's going on in those spaces, that opens up opportunities for you, really, it gives you insight that you wouldn't already have. And I suppose we are a very big community, into the sense that we work together quite a lot, so there's lots of open doors really there. But in terms of Agile, obviously there is a responsibility that I'm putting my Scrum Masters on relevant training, and that I'm myself making sure that I'm up to date on changes to approaches to SAFE, and making sure, SAFE in and of itself has become its own real world and subculture of Agile as a more general approach. And SAFE is fantastic at providing content, podcasts, opportunities to hear from SAFE fellows who are across the world, the experts in those fields. And SAFE felt very progressive when it came out, because it was seeking to answer the question of, how do you do Scrum and Agile as a business is scaling, and how do you do it at an enterprise level? You know, traditionally the Agile hotbed was those small Agile with a small a,
Yeah.
agile teams
Yeah.
of a few people, and where they're all co-located in the same building,
Yeah.
and they're in the trenches together. And there was a point where that was great, but how do you scale that then to the new world where hybrid working is so important?
Yeah.
And even before that, when companies were opening international offices and they were using companies like Godel or other companies that provided, or opening their own offices on, you know, offshore.
Yeah.
How do you then use the agile processes at scale? And so SAFE really was a response to that, and has continued to be a response to that. And they're a community that are very open to the idea that maybe they didn't get it exactly right the first time, and are not in their nature particularly purist, in the sense that when you look at the big picture of SAFE, it is a little bit like a self-serve pick and mix of which of these elements of the implementation are going to serve your business best. So, you know, aside from what the organization has wanted to do strategically and in the market, and you know, it's worth saying as well, in that space we also have to keep up to date in terms of being responsible to our customers on things like regulatory trends and compliance trends, etc. And we have a whole team of people who are responsible for doing that and keeping the finger on the pulse. But yeah, in the agile space, obviously, yeah, it's the remit of the head of product delivery, and setting that expectation that anybody in that function, the scrum masters, delivery managers, are doing the same.
And I suppose this is like what you've done with the Tote Group in your career in general, but I suppose is that, you know, you're so passionate about agile delivery and changes, but I suppose is that what keeps you motivated, that you don't ever feel like it's complete, there's always so much to learn? And
yes, and I often refer to like change and transformation agents as Mary Poppins characters, where they really do like to come in, survey the situation, get everything in just fit spot. And there does tend to be a sense of sort of when my time is done, you know, when I know that I've done my work, when I've done what I came to do. But it's so nuanced. You don't really, it's not one specific thing that tells you, oh, the transformation is done, because like you said, it never really is. The way I've always described it though is, what I'm trying to do is recreate that feeling of you're in a car and you're going to Scarborough, and it's your best friends in there with you, and it's the sun is shining, there's not another car on the roads, you've got amazing tunes, great snacks in the car, right? Versus I'm going, but at the end of the day you're going to Scarborough, right? On the other side of the coin, you're going to Disneyland, but you're on your own, and there's tons of traffic, and it's, you know, raining really hard outside, you really need a wee, and you haven't got any snacks, and there is just no end in sight. It doesn't really matter you're going to Disneyland, right? You're going to get to Disneyland and be really annoyed, and be like, what, I've just wasted so many hours of my life. You'll be grumpy, you're not going to be able to, it's going to take you a while to get over that. And then if you got told you have to go do it all again, and but this time you're going to Bora Bora, you'd be like, I'm all right, thanks. I'm fine, I'd rather not go. I
want my tea and snacks.
Whereas if ideally you're going to Disneyland and you've got your best mates in the car, and the sun's shining, and there's no traffic on the roads. But that's not always, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think both of those things can happen. And when I'm going into a business, I would, for a transformation, I would tend to find the Disneyland version of that versus the Scarborough version.
Me too.
And ultimately the people who are going to Scarborough, they'll keep wanting to go back because they just had the best time, right? This is really where, you know, it's never boring. It never gets old, because this is so much about the culture and the people, just as much, if not more, really, I would argue, than the processes themselves. And of course you need good processes, and of course you need good you know, tech capability to back it up, and all of those things. But if you fundamentally don't have the right culture where openness, transparency, you're free to challenge and free to try and change things, if that doesn't exist, you're always on that dreary road to Disneyland.
And we don't want to be on that road.
You don't want to be there. You just don't. You know?
No, that makes sense. And I suppose just final question, and it feels right to have you on as a guest, just talking about this topic and so enthusiastically as well. But for anyone who's wanting to break into that agile space, what would be your advice?
Yeah, so I mean, my background is slightly unique. Well, I wouldn't say unique. That's doing myself probably too much credit.
Yeah.
But I guess what you tend to see is this idea that people who are in agile delivery or change and transformation within tech teams, they themselves need to have been in tech before doing that. And it's really not the case. Don't get me wrong. There are times where I wish I had been a developer at some point. I wish I'd been a QA at some point, just so I could get exactly what they're talking about the first time they said it without having to ask any questions. But my background was more in real traditional sort of project management, delivery management of consultancy services in the cybersecurity space. And what it showed me, though, is exactly what I love about my job now, is that you can deliver something on paper, but if the processes weren't right, then it can all be undone, really. Like, it can all have been for nothing. And I made the transition by just deciding this is what I'm going to go and do. I started to self-fund some of my agile qualifications and then baked it into my PDP inside my role at my job, and I got my work to agree to fund the rest of it for me. So I think don't be scared to self-fund things. I think nowadays it's great if you've got an employer who's super supportive and you're in sort of a space that the skills that you learn within an agile qualification are transferable, then brilliant. We're not all in that situation though. So don't be scared to self-fund. Find whatever you think is going to be the most relevant, the thing that even if you explicitly then don't directly move into a Scrum Master role or an Agile coach role, that you can still take knowledge from and use in other areas of your career. Is a great way to start. I also think the Agile community, it can seem intimidating, but we're all just a bunch of people who are trying to figure out the best way to solve other people's problems. So there's a kinship there that ultimately you all know what it feels like to be asked a question like, how can you fix this? And you don't immediately know the answer. So we're all just on the quest for those answers, really. And I found the Agile community to be one of the most understanding of what it feels like to be on the outside. So we all know what it feels like to be the first person to say, oh, I'm going to make that transition. Okay, well, how am I going to do it? I want to go to an Agile meetup. In Manchester, there's some great ones. There's some really big supporters of Agile ways of working as well in terms of employers. So you've got, Money Supermarket, you've got Co-op, you've got, and Digital. You've got some really, really big businesses there that are advocates, and they've got advocates working for them, and they're very willing to give their time. So reach out, go to the sessions. I know it might be daunting, but the only way to really, outside of getting a job in the space, the only way to really learn is through osmosis and to be surrounded by those people who are living it day to day. And if anyone is really struggling, find me on LinkedIn and message me. I'm more than happy to point people in the right direction, because people did it for me when I was sort of starting out, and it is what makes the most difference. So I've got somebody coming next week for work experience, and that's just giving them a week in the life of a Scrum Master, for example. So these sorts of things, they don't need to be massive either. They could be a couple days here or there, just to see if you enjoy it, and start to piece together some of your learnings that you're getting on the side. There's so many resources out there now in terms of podcasts, videos, tutorials. You can teach yourself the basics of Agile at home without spending any money.
Said it here. And this is why you're here today.
And I'll point you in the directions of all those resources if you need them, but it really is that easy.
No, brilliant. Oh, well, thank you so much. We could talk about Agile delivery all day, but I think that's
happily
all we have time for today. But thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you so much, guys. It's been lovely talking to you.
Huge huge thank you to all the listeners out there who've listened to this instalment of the Godel Pod. If you like what you hear and would like to know when we're releasing even more episodes, please just subscribe to the Godel page on Podbean or Spotify.